You're listening to Navigating the French on Paris Underground Radio.
Hello, and welcome to Navigating the French, the podcast where each episode we look at a French word and try and see what it tells us about French culture. I'm your host, Emily Monaco. Today, I'm chatting with Charlie Whitesides, a French teacher and the founder of Street French, a resource for Anglophones who want to speak French like the French do. He's here to chat all about a French word that encompasses slang and so much more. Argot. So welcome, Charlie. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Hello, thank you.
And bonjour as well, as I'm sure that you're used to telling people that you have to start conversations with bonjour here in France.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, it's a big thing. And I'm sure that you are saddled with that quite a bit because, as I'm sure you can explain better to our listeners than I can, that's kind of your job here in France, isn't it?
Yeah, I've been here for 6 years and I teach French. I work with expats all over the world and I teach them everything that they never learned in French class.
Okay. And so what made you so motivated to share, what you have dubbed street French as opposed to sort of the standard textbook French that we all learn when we take French class in school, for example?
Well, I did my bachelor's in French and I'm actually finishing up my master's in French. And I just realized what we learned in school wasn't really helpful in real life a lot of times. We learned a lot of things that aren't really said. And I just thought that was really odd. And I realized there was a market for it and that, that's how this whole thing started.
All right. And I'm super excited to chat with you about this and sort of a myriad of other aspects of the modern French language, the contemporary French language, because it is evolving for as much as the Académie Française would like to keep it stuck in the past. And the word that we're going to be chatting about today is argot. So argot, A-R-G-O-T, which is the French word for slang. Now, in your time living here and teaching people about the French language, have you noticed that there is a certain way that people are perceived in France when they use slang?
I think it really depends, but something that I've noticed is that it's respected to be able to do both. Like if you're at a cafe or comptoir, and you can just speak like everyone else, you just have this kind of, daily life, how people speak in everyday life. But you can also express yourself really well, like in a business meeting or something like that. I think it's important to be able to do both.
Yeah, and that's something that I think is really interesting just in terms of, so when I first came to France, I came as a student and I was in French school. And I remember even as a student who, as the teachers were expecting that I was a French person, a native French speaker, which I was not. But even my classmates who were native French speakers were asked to think about language in terms of register. So like soutenu, standard, and familier. Is that something that you've encountered much in your work?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, soutenu is, what the president speaks when he is addressing the nation. And then we have standard, which is pretty much what we learn in school. And then also we have familier, which is, slangy kind of how people speak every day with their families and their friends and things like that. I find that it's good to be able to be in between standard and familier. Just in everyday life here in France, that's just how I hear people speak, somewhere in between the two. I mean, one good example would be like the word ne, right? Like if you're negating something, even if I'm using vous, I'm still not going to use ne, which I found really interesting.
That is really interesting. So like to break that down, like all French negatives in standard French have to be a double negative. So it's like exactly what we weren't taught to do in English. So you start your negative with a ne and you finish it with a pas, so you can signal, where your negative is. And people these days are dropping the ne, and it's so interesting to find that like even at that more what would you call it, the more formal you, the vous.
Exactly. Even though I'm using vous with someone, I'm still not going to use ne. I'm just. And I don't hear people do it either, which is, well, I always found that really interesting.
Yeah, that's super interesting. And it's sort of this mixing between, something that we're using as a sign of respect, which is the vous, but then also, like you said about, being able to dance back and forth between those two registers of like being able to be familiar, at the café comptoir. And then if you suddenly see your professor come in, like you're going to have to switch language register all of a sudden.
Yeah, definitely.
Argot is an interesting jumping off point for us, but I think that slang in English, because we don't have such distinct language registers in American English, like it's less about the individual slang words maybe and more about like this whole way of speaking. So when you're teaching like street French, are you teaching like a vocabulary list or are you teaching like a way of speaking with unique sentence structures and like a unique approach to the language or a little bit of both?
Well, when I teach French, I mean, we start with just words and, maybe how, like sentence structures, things like that. Like an example would be inversions. Like if we have something like veux-tu, or, like, do you want something? Most people are not really going to say that in real life. They're going to say est-ce que tu veux, or they'll just say tu veux un pain au chocolat or whatever. You like, do you want this thing? They'll take a statement and they'll add like a question mark at the end and it with an inflection and it becomes a question. You know what I mean?
Yeah, totally.
So I'll start with that, and then for my advanced students, I'll take it even steps way further. I'll talk to them about facial expressions and how a lot of how we communicate is actually nonverbal and gestures and the tone of your voice and just how to sound more like a French person. I tell my students it's like being an actor or an actress and you're portraying what a French person, sounds like.
Oh my gosh, that must be so interesting to teach because obviously in France, there are some pretty unique facial expressions. And obviously, we're
Mm-hmm.
on a podcast, so we're going to have to be pretty descriptive. But,
Mm-hmm.
like, are there any facial expressions that you think people misconstrue or like they don't make quite right when they're first here that are kind of the secret to communicating well in France?
To me, it's just funny because, noises and facial expressions, that all of that means something in French, right? And it's something that we don't really get taught in school. Like, I remember one time I was in Tokyo and I saw this guy from far away and he was like, like he did that thing with his, like where he exhaled, and I was like, I know this guy's French for sure. And he was.
Oh my God, I know exactly what you mean. Like forcible sigh, like you're deflating.
Yeah, like you'll ask someone something and they'll be like, oh, boof, bosh. Like, and it's just, yeah. And so
Yeah.
that's what I try to work on with my advanced students and get them to that point.
Oh, that's so fun. I remember, okay, this is not going to paint me in a very good light, but that's okay. When I moved back here, I was being placed into a French language level and you had to take like a diagnostic test. But the night before, a bunch of the new students and I went out drinking. And so I showed up to my diagnostic test totally hungover. And the professor was interviewing me, was like, asked me some question. I don't even remember what it was. And while I was trying to buy time to think, I was like, oh, bah. And he's like, ah, mais you're French, just from hearing my thinking noise. So that must be a pretty major thing major tool that you're giving foreigners here, as is this like inhabiting the French way of speaking. It's not just words. There's no words.
Yeah, yeah. It just adds so much, a little, like, it takes you a long way.
Now, when it comes to like swearing or curse words in French, do you get the impression that they're seen as more or less severe than they are in English?
I feel like it's so much less severe in French, especially if you watch French TV. I mean, they say things that you could just never say on American TV.
Do you have any examples?
I mean, just, the classic putain, like, you couldn't really say that on American TV.
Yeah.
Or, I mean, just recently, I mean, we'll talk about it later, but the the French president saying "emmerdé," that he wanted to, piss off the the non-vaccinated people.
Well, yeah, let's talk about that now. So, what exactly in French did Macron say? And I think so he was basically responding to this swathes of the population who didn't want to have to deal with the peste sanitaire and didn't want to feel obligated to get vaccinated, right?
Hmm.
And so what was his response?
Yeah, so he used the word "emmerdé," and it would translate to he wants to piss off the people who are not vaccinated, or but I find it a little bit more vulgar than that in French because it actually has the word merde like in the verb. Yeah, so it's pretty strong for a president to say.
Yeah, it's really, I mean, really strongly. It's like literally, it would be like, I put them in the shit, which is not what we would say at all. But It kind of reminded me a little bit of it's a very different context, but a few years back when Nicolas Sarkozy was refusing to speak to someone and he said, Casse-toi, pauvre con.
Mm.
And so obviously,
Classic.
yeah, classic. And seeing like men in power in France like using these expressions is a little jarring, but also it's not bleeped out on television.
The thing about the Sarkozy thing that was really shocking, it was how he was smiling and shaking hands with everyone, yet insulting this guy.
Yeah.
It was a yeah, it's interesting video.
Yeah. Now, when it comes to the actual like slang and the way that people speak in France, you know, it obviously evolves with time as it does in any language. And I think that we often have this image, this idea of the French language being very standardized and stuck in its time, you know, with the Académie Française, who are like the immortal defensors of the French language. But we actually see like expressions and slang kind of surfacing at various points in history. I know specifically that Victor Hugo in Les Miserables, which is published in the 19th century, devotes whole chapters to the ways in which like the street urchins used to speak in France. So are you frustrated at all by the way that people kind of perceive French as being something that doesn't move or change with the times?
Oh no, I try not to get frustrated about anything in general. But that's the funny thing about language is that it evolves, you know. Like our parents grew up saying things like groovy and it's just words like that have fallen out of fashion and that's the beauty of languages. They evolve. I mean, like French, it used to, it came out of Latin and all the Romance languages, they're basically speaking Latin badly, and that's where they came from.
Yeah. And when you said groovy, it definitely made me think of one sort of former trend that we saw in French that I think might be falling by the wayside, but you are probably better positioned to talk about it than I am, which is verlan. So can you tell me a little bit about what verlan is and who uses it?
Oh, Verdun. Okay, so you're pretty much taking the word l'envers and you're saying it backwards, Verlan. So you're saying the word backwards, right? And it's a type of French slang. I think it was developed in the 60s. And one of my professors told me that it was because, students, they wanted to be rebels and go against society. And so they started saying things backwards, right? Like a good example would be the word femme, right? And it becomes meuf, right? And it means like a chick or, a slang way to say a woman, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's funny. Well, I mean, it's funny, but it's also kind of sad when people devote so much time to speaking French, right? To learning French, and they come to France, and people here are literally speaking backwards.
And I think there might even be some cases of verlan like being applied twice to the same word. I think that the one that I heard, let me see if I can get this right. So it was like to denote someone of Arab origin, the word in French is arabe, and then they turned that to beurre,
Hmm.
and then it's rebeu.
Yeah.
Are there any other like examples of verlan that you see still being used today? Or if you use verlan, are you going to sound like you're saying groovy or, you know?
Oh, no, no, it's still very much used today. I love the word chelou. It means like sketchy or weird. Relou, it's the verlan of lourd. Like, yeah, it means like if I say, oh, il est relou, it means like, oh, this guy sucks, like he's like, you know. Yeah, sometimes I'm talking, when I talk to some of my French friends, I hear something that I don't know, like a word I don't know, and I just put it backwards. I'm like, oh, okay, yeah, it's that word. Like someone said chez wam, and it's like, oh, chez moi, of course.
Okay. Awesome.
Yeah, so it adds just like maybe another level of difficulty, but I definitely hear a lot of Valon.
Yeah. If you're enjoying this episode of Navigating the French, you may also be interested in our sister podcast, Paris: A State of Mind, where real estate experts Gail and Marie give you all the tips and tricks you need about renting and buying apartments in Paris and beyond. Navigating the French will be right back after a word from our sponsors. And now, back to Navigating the French. And one thing that is sometimes hard as an American, and I assume that you must have the same maybe difficult, maybe not because you're listening to it all the time, but there is like a tendency in France more and more to borrow English words into French, and they don't always mean what they mean when we say them, but they're pronounced in a really heavy French accent, obviously. And so you have these borrowed words. Like I definitely heard someone call a restaurant style like très Brooklyn
Oh,
to say that it had like exposed brick.
yeah. So yeah, it's you touched on so many things here. I mean, I love it when I hear a word in English. Sometimes I don't even understand what it is because it has such a heavy French accent on it. But yeah, I always find that really interesting. And then the French obsession with Brooklyn never ceases to to fascinate me. Yeah, I mean, I just hear things like that like all the time. Like someone say, "Oh, c'est trop dark." I heard someone in a store once say, "On est trop badass." Like, I mean, I can't even do it because it's an English word. It feels odd putting such a heavy French accent on it.
But it's happening really fast. And I remember like when I obviously it's always kind of awkward to like pronounce something from your native language in the local accent.
Mm.
But I remember when I used to say where I was from, and I'm from Manhattan, and I would say Manhattan, mais quoi? Bah, Manhattan. Quoi? J'ai pas compris. But Manhattan. Ah, Manhattan. Okay. So like dark, I love. C'est trop dark.
Yeah.
Are there any other funny ones that you've heard crop up?
I mean, I've heard speed. Have you heard that one recently?
I've heard that one. Yeah, yeah, yeah. What does it mean?
Speed, like, like speed, like the word fast, right? Oh, c'est trop
Uh-huh.
speed. But I actually hear people say that in Valon, and they'll say de speed.
Oh my God. That's
But I
wild.
think it's more high schoolers who will say something like that.
Okay. Because for as much as they like to pretend that they don't borrow words, the French really do. Like, I mean, I hear more people when they say doctor, they don't say médecin, which is the French word. They say toubib, which is the Arabic word, and they've
Mm,
borrowed it into French. So it's pretty elastic, especially in terms of the street French that you're teaching.
yeah, definitely. A lot of borrowed words.
How do you find out what's moving and changing in the French language because it's changing so fast? I mean, do you have a lot of French friends? Do you listen to, high school kids talking to each other? What do you do to make sure that your street French is staying current?
Oh, the high school kids, I just let them have, even when I go back to the US, half the time I don't know what they're saying. I just kind of gave up on that. This is a thing that I think like 90% of people would just never have to worry about, like staying up to date with street French and like what people are currently saying. I find that a lot of my clients, they don't have, that's not their real problem. It's more like being afraid to speak, the stringing sentences together fluidly, that sort of thing. But for me, it's really my hobby and my lifestyle. Like I gave myself this goal of speaking French as well as I possibly could, and it'll take like a lifetime to do. And it's just something that I just love. So I always try to follow French people on Instagram, like as much as I can, because I just want to hear how people are speaking nowadays. That's one way I get in some daily practice, or I have a fair amount of French friends. I just look for different ways I can fit French into my life.
That's awesome. And it's such a modular goal where you can easily, if it's just Instagram for a little while, you can do Instagram, or you can hang out with friends, or you can watch a whole TV show or something, which I think is really nice for people at home who feel overwhelmed by trying to learn a whole other version of the language that they learned in school.
Yeah, I mean, I find one of the best ways, and this is what I tell my clients all the time, is to watch vlogs or listen to podcasts. Because the thing when you're watching a film or a TV show, it's scripted, and sometimes they talk like this for dramatic effect, and it's just not the same as someone improvising in the language.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that's why I tell my students a lot is you want to hear someone speaking how they normally would, even with background noise or whatever. And I find you really get that in vlogs and podcasts.
That's an awesome tip. Do you have any like favorites off the top of your head, favorite vlogs or podcasts that you like to listen to?
One that I really like is J'irai dormir chez vous. And I think he's actually, have you seen the show?
I have. I love this show. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think he's actually one of the first vloggers ever. Like he has this like three camera thing that he straps to his chest, and he just wanders about in foreign countries trying to get people to let him sleep at their house. And yeah, and you'll see all the facial expressions that we've been talking about, all the noises. Je peux, enfin. He really speaks like that, and he's just a really funny guy. I enjoy the show a lot.
And do you find that, I mean, I can hear it from you, but do you find that you have to encourage your students to almost change their voice and their demeanor when they're speaking French? Like, because I've heard from bilingual people that you almost have a different personality when you're speaking a different language properly. Like, do you find that to be true?
Well, for one thing that I could say that I've found out recently is, this is my American voice. I find that it's much higher, mais quand je parle français, c'est beaucoup plus grave. Je sais pas si t'entends. But I can't really speak French up here, like in my American voice. Like, si je parle français comme ça, it just doesn't sound right. I sound more like Canadian or something. But
Oh, that's true.
yeah, no disrespect to them. I love their accent. I love the Quebecois accent. But I always wanted more like a metropolitan France kind of accent. So, and I just kind of copied how people spoke around me, and I noticed that French men, they just sound a lot deeper. Their voice sounds a lot deeper. But yeah, I mean, this is something that my friend and I were talking about the other day, how you can't really know someone unless you understand their native language. They'll never be able to express themselves exactly the same way. I mean, some people can get really close. Maybe if you've been speaking the language for 20 years, maybe, it's different. But you know what I mean?
I totally do. And I think like I've often found I've been living here for over a decade. I'm bilingual, and I do find that like my personality emerges differently in both languages. And if I have a French friend who I know really well, eventually I'll start speaking to them in English, even in little bits and pieces, even when they're not fluent, just so they can see like a glimpse of like my original personality. Cause my
Mm,
one in French is maybe a little more cutting, maybe like a little. It's hard to assume that French attitude and not be like a little bit mean.
It took me a long time to understand that that's just how the language works. If you ask someone something like, oh, bah, je sais pas, like if you translate that directly to English, it comes off as really rude, but they're not trying to be rude. It's just that's how the language is, you know?
Exactly. So in all of your sort of keeping tabs on the French language and in teaching people, the French that's really spoken today, do you have any expressions that you think are particularly fun that you love to teach, especially your advanced students, the ones who are kind of ready for a little bit more of that level up on their street French?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, this kind of goes back to what you were saying before about how knowing someone in their language. I mean, I find that there are a lot of expressions or even, vocabulary words that are just funnier in French, and the same thing in English, that they just work better in English. Like, when I take a test to lighten the mood a little bit, like at school, I like to say, "Oh, you guys want a race?" And that doesn't work at all in French. It doesn't sound nearly as funny. Some good expressions that I like. I really like the word bordel personally, like sound bordel. I just find it really funny to say this thing's a mess. Yeah, that's that's probably my go-to word. Like, oh, est-ce que tu peux ranger ton bordel? Can you clean your mess, please?
And it's such a useful one because I mean it has roots in bordello, so in like a
Mm,
whorehouse, but you can say it for like a physical mess, and you can say it for like traffic jam, like c'est
mm.
trop le bordel, and you can even say it for like the weather or like the line at the post office. It's a useful expression in French. I like that one.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I mean, and that kind of goes back to what we were saying earlier, how I think pretty much anyone would be able to say that word. Whereas, if you took like, a word similar to that in English, like my mother, I know she never swears. It's just like her thing. She's like, no, we don't talk like that in this house. So like, which goes back to how I think swearing and speaking this way is just a lot less severe in French.
Yeah, definitely. You'd certainly hear some parents sort of asking their kids to speak nicer, but not to the same extent that I think, I wasn't allowed to say shut up in my house. So
Oh yeah.
that's a funny one in French too. When they say shut up, they can say tais-toi, but they also say ta gueule,
Mm.
which I love because gueule is the name for like the face of an animal. So it's like it's not even shut up, it's like your face, but your animal face.
Yeah, I guess it comes from ferme ta gueule, like kind of close your muzzle, I suppose, right? And then they just shortened it to ta gueule. And there are all these different expressions with that word that I just love, like se casser la gueule, fall down. So it's kind of like to break your muzzle or your animal face. Faire la gueule, to like frown or have like a sour look on your face. Gueule de bois as well, like the for a hangover.
Oh wow, there are a lot.
Yeah, it's funny because I actually wrote a book called Swearing Like a Parisian. And what I did was I went out with my French friends in Paris for like a year and I just wrote down everything that they said. And I put it all in this book. And there's actually a vulgarity scale. So you know how vulgar something is. And yeah, so I have a whole section about gueule.
Oh man, that's such a use, and the vulgarity scale is very useful.
Mm.
What do you think? I don't know. Do you feel comfortable saying it on a podcast? What do you think, like, the most vulgar thing you can
You
say in
know,
France?
to say to a French person, it's really vulgar when you insult their parents. And there are a lot of expressions or insults where you insult someone's parents. And I feel like in English, we hear it so much that it's kind of like, oh, we don't really care. But if you say that to someone in French, you can pretty much be guaranteed to get into a fist fight after. It's really bad.
Oh wow, that's really interesting. Because yeah, in English, it's almost like a joke, like the "yo mama" jokes. It's like whatever, but
Yeah.
yeah. Oh wow, interesting. Okay. And in Quebec, I know they do a lot of religious swearing, but I don't think that has made it over to France. There's no like, it's pretty secular swearing in France, right?
Yeah, definitely. That has not made it over.
Okay. Awesome. Well, Charlie, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today. I will definitely drop a link to your book in the show notes for anybody who's interested in learning more about street French and the vulgarity scale, as well as a link to your website if you feel like you need a crash course in everything street French. Before I let you go, I just have one last question for you, and that is, what is your favorite word in French?
My favorite word. Oh, kind of putting me on the spot like that.
I know that's the point.
I think my favorite word is assumer. It's not slang. I don't even know how I would translate that exactly to English, but assumer, it means to like live your truth, to assume like you. I guess that would be it, live your truth. And I really like that word.
I love that. And you're living your truth here, creating your own way of living your dream. So that's awesome.
Yeah, I try.
Well, thank you so much for joining me. Have a great rest of your day.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
This has been Navigating the French. You can find more from me, Emily Monaco, at Emily_in_France on Twitter and Instagram. This podcast is produced by Paris Underground Radio. To listen to other episodes of this podcast or to discover more podcasts like it, please visit parisundergroundradio.com. Thanks for listening, and à bientôt.
This episode of Navigating the French was produced by Jennifer Garrity for Paris Underground Radio. For more on this show and shows like it, please visit parisundergroundradio.com.